Fresno, Fresno, that's my hometown. Fresno, Fresno, that's my hometown.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we go home to 2729 West Griffith Way, Fresno, California, 1964. This is a decidedly different mood from the previous chapter, whereas Saroyan's travels to foreign countries often spoke of escapism from cultural expansion as a youth to IRS troubles as an adult. Fresno always grounds us again. It's home, filled with familiar faces, or at least familiar last names, the staggering heat that Saroyan embraces as his own, and locations filled with nostalgia. In 1963, he tells us, he was taking a day trip from San Francisco to Fresno. He had purchased a flat in Paris in 1961 and was jet-setting between various homes. He took his 1959 Carmen Ghia, purchased in Belgrade, down the California roads, and took a peek at some of his old haunts in Fresno. He stopped for root beer and was overcome with nostalgia. He booked a room at the Californian Hotel and proceeded to purchase 2 newly made tract houses on West Griffith Way. After that, he split his time between Paris and Fresno. A likely combination, don't you think? Saroyan liked to drive. He took several cross-country road trips, one of which was the basis for Short Drive's Sweet Chariot, and often drove from Fresno to Malibu or Fresno to San Francisco. He wrote in 1953, "The drives from Fresno to San Francisco or Los Angeles, around 200 miles each, or from San Francisco or Los Angeles to Fresno, are commonplace, but exciting every time I take them. I guess it has to do with leaving one place and heading for another." He lived between Paris and Fresno, one small apartment in Paris at Rue Tabu, and 2 tract houses on Griffith Way. In the Fresno Bee, Eli Sentencich describes one of Saroyan's Fresno houses. "One of the few times he allowed me in to his modest tract home, overflowing with manuscripts and magazines, half-filled coffee cups and unwashed glasses." This is how his Paris house was described as well, not quite a livable space for nearly anyone but Saroyan alone. He filled his land in Fresno with fruit trees and overgrown plants, reveling in the growth in the desert of the San Joaquin Valley. In Goodbye Wild Bill, William Chaudres wrote of the house in Fresno, "Sunflowers with stalks as big as a man's arm sentineled the narrow path. Saroyan bought 2 tract houses side by side, and promptly left them alone. The first, a weed-grown corner dwelling, stood empty at all times, his buffer against the world. The second was even worse, or better if you shared Saroyan's view. Roof-high vegetation concealed him from prying neighbors. The horticultural clutter included grapevines, apricot, fig, and apple trees. And on the ground, melon vines. Like green snakes, they twined with clumps of Thompson seedless grapes. Everything needed trimming, including Saroyan. I would learn that he got his haircuts from his cousin Archie Manassian when he could. 'Ain't this some spot?' he roared, his brown eyes twinkling. 'Drives the Fresno city fathers crazy. They've threatened to mow my yard to make it conform to all the rest of the block. But 2729 West Griffith Way stays like it is. I'd fight 'em all the way to the Supreme Court if they touched a single sunflower.'" He can be thought of as a hometown boy in both Fresno and San Francisco, both cities providing for him during critical developmental time periods. But Fresno is the one that called to him. It's also the one that to this day hails him as a hometown hero. San Francisco was a little too big for that and has been home to many important people. Being the big fish in an agricultural town was a little more attainable. And then there was Fresno, a railroad town, nothing like Boston, New York, Charleston, New Orleans, Chicago, Denver, or San Francisco, a nothing place with 11,000 people. And though he never wanted it, his name has been splashed on schools, theaters, and museums in Fresno. Fresno was a sensory place to Saroyan. Though he remembered it filled with family, he often wrote about it in terms of the imagery. There was the heat, and most notably all the different fruits that were grown there and their various stages of growth. This is illustrated at great length in the collection My Name is Aram, and he paints the region as fertile and life-giving, even if it was forced into that state by the hand of man. The fact that Fresno was fertile but tended to revert back to a barren desert, as illustrated in the pomegranate trees, was something that Saroyan used thematically and seemed to fascinate him throughout his career. Life and art imitated each other in Saroyan's writing, especially when it came to Fresno. At his place on West Griffith, he was listed in the phone book in Fresno as Aram Garoglanian, the name of the narrator in My Name is Aram. In London in 1944, I used to pay a British pound for a bunch of grapes. I ate the grapes and remembered Fresno, my father long dead, my mother at least in a brand new home of her own in San Francisco. In those days, a British pound was worth about $5, and the only grapes to be had in London were from hothouses. Saroyan felt his career slowing down, felt the desire to begin constructing his literary legacy in the form of a library or archives. In 1966, he created the William Saroyan Foundation to begin this process. In 1963, he wrote in his journal, The big problem is place, my own proper sensible place, in which to gather all of my stuff out of storage and from San Francisco, and to have there, reasonably protected against fire and theft, so to say, except that such anxiety is absurd. Against time is what we mean, against change, against insignificance, uselessness, death. Well, where is that place to be? I thought Fresno, but Fresno is virtually impossible and hopeless. Real estate is a way out there and ridiculous, and the overall atmosphere continues pretty stupid. Well, how about New York? The city is an idea, most likely, except it's too costly again. The state is perhaps okay, or at any rate one of the eastern seaboard states. New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and so on. Mainly, though, I feel that my place should be where the sun is always near and almost always hot. Mexico? Not quite for me, although I have always been fond of it. Well, the hell with it. I will do my best as always and wait and see. He had toyed with owning a house in Fresno before he purchased the Griffith Way house in 1964. In 1948, he purchased land that turned out to be a disappointment. He sold it at a loss. Every time I bought real estate, I lost. I balanced those losses as I balanced losses at gambling, by extra work. I bought a house on a hill overlooking a river in Fresno a few years after I got out of the Army, because I had first seen the place as a small boy at a picnic. The real estate man said the place was a steal. He said the whole 40 acres of barren land was composed of something he called puma tile, an ashy soil out of which bricks are made for the building of homes. He said the brickmakers would do all the work and pay me so much a ton. He said I could always get my money back any time I wanted to. But when I moved to New York 6 months later and wanted my money back, I got less than $5,000 for the $17,500 I had paid. The Internal Revenue didn't allow the loss as a deduction either. Bill and Carol drove from San Francisco to Fresno to look at a farmhouse for sale. This was more William's plan than Carol's, who still missed the cosmopolitan East Coast, but loved Bill. They found a farm called Lane's Bridge on the road to Yosemite. It had 26 acres bordering the San Joaquin River. It cost $32,000, and they asked Carol's mother, Roisin, for $10,000 for the down payment, and William's uncle Miron for another $10,000. This was ultimately a debacle that led to more gambling losses and another break between him and Carol, who took the children back to New York. So far, Fresno real estate hadn't been kind to him. In this chapter, he stays in the Californian Hotel, or the Hotel Californian, on Van Ness Avenue. It was built in 1923 and may have felt like one of the only familiar things to Bill in 1964, overlooking a very changed Armenian town. Downtown Fresno had been a bustling, lively place for him to grow up, but began its fall into urban decay in the 1960s as businesses moved north. He thinks fondly on the gambling joints on Broadway, maybe the Plantation Club or the Olympia House or Hank's Place or older ones. For a time, Broadway was the center of gambling in Fresno and was a big draw to the city. In Days of Life and Death and Escape to the Moon, he wrote, In November 1968, in a tract house about a quarter mile from the Southern Pacific freight yards in Fresno, every day I remember somebody I used to see here 50 years ago. His home was built by Oscar Spano in 1963, but tract homes were popping up all over Fresno and California in general. This location was also special because it was near Roding Park, designed in 1903, another old place of remembrance to Saroyan. The new and the old mixing together, aptly metaphorical for his own mental state at the time. I myself have wanted to know what impelled me to buy first the corner house and then the house beside it. Was this the moving of the line to the completed circle? Had I come back to die where I was born? Or was it simply that I could afford a couple of bargain houses? This book, Days of Life and Death and Escape to the Moon, published in 1970, meditates on Saroyan's return to Fresno and what it meant to him, being his published journals from Paris and Fresno, 1967 and 1968. In his biography, William Saroyan, R.M. Saroyan writes of the two residences, quote, "Both of these neighborhoods tended to isolate the writer. In Fresno, he was a famous, if rather eccentric, older man in a community of young families, and, as the neighborhood evolved, increasingly families of ethnic minorities. One of his houses was purchased specifically to provide storage space for his collections. The one next to it was for the writer himself." End quote. According to R.M., William was building his own archives in these houses, collecting everything that would be placed in a library through the William Saroyan Foundation. R.M. posited that things were less demanding than people, and so they would represent William better than a legacy of human relationships. While relationships could and did fall apart, William's things would make him immortal. In his will, Saroyan wished for the Fresno houses to be retained and used in connection with the organization, assembly, and processing of the Saroyan collection, which consisted of all the materials that were the product of his creativity, and in connection with the educational and charitable purposes of the foundation. Casually, he wanted it to be an archives and museum for young Armenian writers to study his legacy. However, it was sold to private owners following his death. Eventually, in 2016, an Armenian group, the Renaissance Cultural and Intellectual Foundation, purchased 2729 Griffith Way and turned it into the William Saroyan House Museum, opening in 2018, a place for study and education, as Saroyan intended it. A lot happened in those houses, as he spent much of the last 17 years of his life in them. In these houses, he suffered from his fatal cancer, and much has been said about the dark time and can be read in his son's emotional telling, Last Rites, from 1982. But before that, the community had pleasant experiences with him, as he found a new way to be himself in his hometown, mentoring writers sometimes 2 generations younger than him. Like all of his places, it was a mixed bag, but it was the circle he most wanted to complete. There was a time that Saroyan hated Fresno, just before he left it in 1926. He was tired of its small-mindedness and remoteness, and San Francisco unlocked his creative aptitude. But eventually he came to understand it as a symbol of the simpler times in his life. He became a part of the fabric of Fresno anew, known as the mustachioed old man who rode his bicycle all over town like a ghost of his childhood self. With My Name is Arm, he introduced the world to Fresno, and to the Armenian community there, and in all of his memoirs he worked through his experiences of Fresno. It was a hard life, being poor, and in a discriminated against a group of people, but it was simpler too because he was a child. Though he moved back to Fresno in his 50s, it had always been making its way into his psyche. In Big Valley Vineyard, published in the Daring Young Man collection, he wrote, "I refer finally to the vineyard from which I have come. I refer, as the last word of these days on earth, to the soil which I have known, and which has known me, and in which I was nourished." And it was into that soil that half of his ashes were buried, nourishing it back. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.